Hey, y'all. I just want to make sure that you understand you're about to watch part two in a two-part series. If you haven't watched part one, highly recommend you go do that. I can't make you, though. You could pretty much do whatever you want.
Hey, Kate.
Hello there.
How are you today?
I'm really well. How are you doing, Lex?
Oh, I'm doing good. So I hear you have some cool stuff to talk to us about today.
Well, it's true. So, hello, everybody. Thank you for spending your time with us. My name is Katie Proctor. I'm a cybersecurity architect with Microsoft. I've worked with Microsoft a little over 25 years now, and the last 20 of them I have been doing just security engagements. And the last 8 of these years, I've been doing recovery of customers who have been compromised. And so that's sort of what leads me to talk about these topics. Having Jim go first is always a bad thing. When I went to Microsoft Presenter School, they only gave me 2 rules. The first one was never talk after Jim Moeller. And the second one was never provide slides that have more than 5 words and 5 bullet points. I have violated both of those rules. And so I guess we're going to take our chances in how we go forward.
So to be fair, you don't know if Jim's going first or not. I might make it so that you're first when we publish this.
Probably you should let Jim go first because some of his stuff sort of feeds into mine.
Oh, okay. All right. I see. Okay. So we'll let Jim go first, and then, ladies and gentlemen, this will be the Katie Proctor show.
Yeah, exactly.
So 25 years. That's awesome.
Well, you've been here longer than that.
I have. I'm almost at 30 years, but it's still rare. You people generally either don't last that long or they leave and they come back. I know a lot of people that have left and then come back. Is it 25 years straight
Yeah,
for you?
yeah,
Yeah.
yep.
Me too. Me too. I've
April
never left.
95.
Yep. Me too. I've never left. I never left. And I'm excited about it. It seems like the closer I get to, I haven't hit 30 yet. I'm almost at 30, and I can't wait. We get a little crystal, a little glass crystal or something
It's a
for
big
30
glass
years.
crystal.
No, that's the 25. For
Oh, wait,
30.
you get a little one. Oh, yeah?
For 30, yeah. So apparently I haven't seen it yet, and this
Yeah.
probably doesn't mean anything to anybody that's watching this. But I think at 30 we get like a glass flame, but I'm not certain. I'll have to look into it. But I think it's like a little glass flame, which is kind of neat. Yeah, it's worth sticking around for. Why not?
Yeah, why not? That paycheck thing doesn't really matter. It's all about the little glass flame.
That's right. It's all about the glass flame
Yeah.
at this point. All right. Well, let's get started.
Well, so here's what we're going to be talking about for this section of the conversation. You can see that the steps here for our talk include what's sort of our philosophy. There are a lot of ways that you could approach a recovery. How do we do that? How do you know when you need a compromised recovery? And what do you do in this special case where it's a ransomware encryption environment? What is it we need to do our eviction? And what are the more detailed steps about what we do? If in fact you want Microsoft to do such an engagement, then let's talk a little bit about what that engagement looks like. And then really maybe the most important slides are the last couple that talk about how do you avoid ever getting to meet me professionally. I know, yeah, I may be a really fun person, but you really never really want to know me.
At least not professionally.
Not professionally, exactly. Okay, so our tenets and our philosophy in this is summed up by the very bottom line of this slide. Compromise recovery is all about compromise. We try to do as much as we can, as quickly as we can, knowing that there are a million things we could do, but we don't have time to do all of them. And over the last 8 years, we've tried to take what recovery means and pare it down to the smallest subset possible. And we think what we do now in compromise recovery is both necessary and sufficient. A few other points that are on the slide are worth mentioning. If you or a customer or a friend all are having any sort of problem like this, probably talking to lawyers, probably talking to the marketing departments is something that should be done early. There are lots of reasons for this, and we won't go into them, but surprisingly, in this very technical environment, lawyers and marketers are really important. As I mentioned, the speed is really important. We need to get stuff done. The scenario in compromise recovery is typically we have an active attacker. Well, if an attacker is exfiltrating content or an attacker is doing something in particular in your environment, we all know you have to get as quickly as you can, you have to get that attacker out. Jim mentioned that the avoiding changes is sort of an old school thing, but you at least need to consider whether or not avoiding changes that tell the attacker you're there is something you need to worry about or not worry about. I mentioned a little bit ago about trying to do the minimum amount possible, and that's the next two bullets about focusing on what's really important for now and avoid fixing the 1,000 things that we could fix that are really important. We all agree they're important. And then sort of finally is that idea that we need to do things that can be left with a customer to own on their own, to be able to handle it on their own. We really don't want to sort of be stuck with a customer, if you will, for a long time, or the customer to be stuck with us for a long time. We want to teach them to fish. We want to show them what needs to be done. And then when that is finished, for us to step away. How do you know you need a compromise recovery? It seems like sort of a stupid question. Although from our side, there are a couple of things that are probably required for a successful compromise recovery. The first one is, are you really a qualified scenario? A qualified meaning you have a targeted attacker. Targeted are typically things that are focused on you, specifically to you. And from our perspective, if you have an active attacker, that's an emergency situation. We move every world we can to make things happen fast. If it's not an active attacker, we tend to turn into the normal process and try to fix things sort of on a regular basis as we can. From the compromise recovery perspective, the way we operate best is to know what the bad guys did, what accounts they used, what machines they had, what their tactics are, and sort of then also what their command and control channels are. For us, that means a good investigation has occurred before we get there. There are a couple times when we have done things without that, and it makes everybody's life more difficult. But what if it's not a current active attacker? What do we do then? Well, that old-fashioned approach, and I'm going to mention a few times in here the 3 Ps. They are patched, paws, and passwords, and I'll talk a lot more about them later. And if the attack is a ransomware, we've been crypto-locked or something like that, clearly we have to return to service before we can get to a place where we can harden or do any sort of active directory recovery.
Yeah.
In order to return to service in the ransomware scenario, we think there are some obvious steps. This is probably nothing new or different than anybody's seen. It's very similar to anybody's disaster recovery plan, I hope. And it starts with, what's the most important thing in the environment? When you have the most important thing in the environment, and you know what the infrastructure dependencies are for those systems, then when you start work, it can be focused on the return to service. The goal is return to service. And each organization sort of decides what that means. It will be different for almost every organization. Once you've decided the critical infrastructure and the critical systems, create a recovery plan for each one. And then I call it a hypercare process, stealing other terms that other people have used. But what this is everybody who's trying to get something up needs a fast path to approval, a fast path to decisions, a fast path to every possible thing. And so we need to set up an environment where all of those things can happen very quickly. And then the hard part comes is executing that return to service plan. Once you have everything up, we can look at what the information is that needs to come in to do an effective CR. And per Michael Malone, he's the one who put together ABCs and accounts, backdoors, and command and control. And so we just leverage Michael's acronym for this. Accounts are the accounts that the attacker used. As you'll see, and I'll talk more about, we add in any domain administrator equivalent account and perhaps the administrators of any critical servers that are in the environment. When we do our eviction, which we call PED, Planned Eviction Day or Planned Execution Day, when we do that, we intend to disable every one of these accounts and create brand new ones. As you can imagine, that might cause a lot of disruption. And so that is a lot of the work on the customer side for what has to happen during either ransomware or compromise recovery. Backdoors are where the malware is. We need to find out what machines have malware on them. If it's a small enough number of machines, we can just remove them from the network and rebuild them at PED. That works great. And then if any DC has actually been touched and has malware on it, well, that's a very special problem because rebuilding all of the DCs is often very difficult in customers that have perhaps hundreds of DCs. And then when we show up and there are 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 machines that are infected, I think of that as reaching the ninth circle of hell. And this is a much more difficult scenario that has much less satisfactory processes, but we have used them many times in that case.
How often do you see that scenario?
I would say at least a third of the time we see lots of machines have malware. Yeah, it depends on the attacker. A lot of attackers try to be subtle, and you only see 15 or 20 machines that have malware on them, and that's a very straightforward scenario. But we go places sometimes where the process for the attacker is to persist on as many machines as possible, hoping that we don't get rid of all of them.
Yeah, so when that happens,
it's sort of a guppy philosophy.
So when you have thousands of infected machines like that, is that generally a sign that the attacker has been in the environment for a long time, or is there no correlation?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it means anything necessarily. Different attackers have different processes, which is why we rely on the investigation to sort of tell us how is this attacker working and what are their processes that they use.
Okay.
And it could well be that the attacker's been there for a long time, but we've been loads of places where the attacker's been there for maybe 2 years. Literally, we just had a customer that 3 weeks ago we finished up with who, when we looked around, found that the attacker had been there almost 2 years. And there were not thousands of machines infected, but there were, I don't know, maybe 20. And in terms of actual malware on them, there were only about 5 machines with actual malware. The other 15 machines were ones that were traversed and touched by the attacker, which we also take into account as a backdoor that we'd like to recreate. The idea that maybe we just didn't find the little sneaky things that they did. The last one, the C, is the command and control, the C2 channels. And so almost all the time, these sorts of malware attacks talk back to some server someplace. And so finding all of those, knowing what they are, watching for new ones to pop up, that's a very important part of compromise recovery because it does take a week or 2 or 4 to get done. We often find new C2 channels showing up. Five steps for eviction in 4 categories. So what do we do during compromise recovery? So in the ransomware recovery, this is post return to service. And we do those 5 steps on the right. As I mentioned, we start with the account disposition, which is the domain administrator equivalent plus the compromised accounts. When I say domain administrator equivalent, we are talking about not just the members of EA, SA, DA, but also any account which has membership in any of about a dozen groups or a dozen different user rights assignments. The classic one is SE backup privilege. If I have an account, a regular everyday Joe user account with SE backup priv, that account can ignore the read ACL on the file system and read any file they want, including the Active Directory DIP file. So John Smith regular everyday account could exfiltrate the DIP file and we would never know. From our perspective, finding domain administrator equivalent accounts is essential to try and remove the possible persistence the attacker might have. As mentioned, when we get to the B part and the finding the malware, trying to figure out a strategy for rebuilding. We had one of these where the malware was on SQL servers, but there were 45 terabytes of SQL Server data. The idea that you're going to completely squash and rebuild a machine like that, or a set of machines like that, is probably not a reasonable alternative. So what do? Well, we come up with a plan that we all will decide is good enough. That middle one, that green one about cloud-based threat analytics with machine learning, this is not just the typical EDR thing that sometimes we see. This is the ability, and there are lots of vendors who provide this, to put your data into a very large scenario for analysis, really detailed analysis and correlation. Obviously, we like Azure ATP and MD ATP, but other vendors provide similar sorts of tools, which we think aren't as good, but you need that level of visibility into what's going on in the environment. Finally, those administrative practices. From our perspective, if we did all the stuff above, but we don't do these next two things on the right-hand side, we aren't done. We will just see this customer next month and the month after and the month after that. And that's a problem for everybody. So the two things that we do are sort of lumped into one idea. We implement security zones. If you've seen any Microsoft security presentation for the last 8 years, it's talked about tier 0, tier 1, tier 2. But the reality is this is the same type of security zone we have been talking about in computing, well, for as long as I've been doing it, which is 38 years. This is just the standard stuff. We determine assets of similar value and similar security requirements. We group those together and then we control access in and out of that security zone. So in compromise recovery, our intent is to implement at least the highest level security zone that Microsoft calls tier 0 with domain controllers in it. As part of that security zone, we must have a way to administrate the servers in that security zone. And so for us, that's a dedicated hardened admin workstation. And Microsoft calls those paws. And you hear about cloud paw and kitten paw and tiger paw, and there's like every form of paw there is. But the reality is, fundamentally, this is an isolation mechanism that allows sort of free and easy movement within the security zone, but stops any control from lower security zones and any exposure of these credentials into lower security zones. Just breaking out the account disposition just a touch. Discovering the domain admin equivalent accounts. We have a couple of tools that do that. We have a set of scripts that do sort of a first pass to start the homework about who are the accounts we need to worry about. But also we have additional tools that look and do a sort of a deep dive discovery into Active Directory and look for 50 or 60 different ways that an attacker might persist in an environment. Obviously, we already mentioned any accounts that are identified by the investigation team. We add those into our account disposition list. But that third bullet down, now that one's the tough one because we find all sorts of accounts in this list: regular user accounts, administrator accounts, service accounts, and things like that. And the idea when we tell them we're going to disable and recreate a brand new account for you, well, if it's your regular account that you're used to getting email on, and we're going to disable and give you a new one, imagine how disruptive that might be to virtually anybody. And in the case of service accounts and application accounts that might be tier 0 application and service accounts, what would it mean to change the service account? Is it possible to change the service account in that application? We come across applications all the time where it's at least difficult, if not impossible, to replace the service account for that. Well, okay, so what are we going to do? Well, we need a different control or a different remediation for those accounts. So that step there about determining appropriate account disposition, that step is the one that takes the longest time. I had a customer 2 months ago who did that work in 10 days. I had a customer 2 years ago who did that work in 4 months. So when people say, how long does it take to do the recovery? I always say it's completely dependent on how fast we can get the preparation done so that our recovery is not worse than the disease. If you happen to sign up for Microsoft to do this, we'd love to do it. We've done a lot of them. I've just started my 33rd and 34th ones this week, and so this is what I do. It's what several of us do. We typically break it down into 3 phases. Everything's broken down into phases, isn't it? The planning phase, where we identify the machine and account dispositions and do all the planning for them, all that homework that goes with it. I say 2 weeks, but as I say, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 4 months. Staging's putting everything together to make sure that we have all the people lined up, all of the logistics lined up, all of the servers that need to be prepped or anything like that. All that gets done in staging. And then finally, typically over a long weekend, we typically with a customer will shut down the internet and go through sort of our eviction steps that disable and recreate all those accounts, reset the DSRM passwords, double tap the Care BTGT account, reset the DC machine accounts, and a few other things like that. Sort of the obvious things that you'd expect. So
is that mostly, do we do that mostly via script?
The eviction part?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is sort of a fun question. And the answer is it depends on how many. If we were talking about 10 accounts, we would probably do those manually.
Yeah.
If we're talking about 500 accounts, it's an impossibility to do manually.
Right.
So we do have scripts that do literally every single little part of this: the disable, the recreate, the re-add to groups, the reattach email, all of those things. We do have scripts to do those things when the numbers are larger than just a few.
Yeah. So the sad thing that I was just thinking about when we're talking about all of this is there's got to be thousands of customers out there that are compromised currently that probably don't even know that they're compromised.
James Comey.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so it's a fun and interesting idea. Sort of my opinion is that if you haven't looked at domain administration and you haven't updated your domain administration to map to the first Pass the Hash white paper that was published in December of 2012, if you haven't done that already, the probability of a bad guy getting in seems pretty high. And I should tell you that every single customer I've talked to, and I've probably talked to 100 or 150 customers in this particular situation, none of them had implemented things that Microsoft wrote down in 2012. Yeah. One of those things has to do with that privilege access workstation. And every place we go, people say, do I really need to have a separate, dedicated, hardened workstation for administration of my domain controllers? And my response is, sure. And when I talk to customers outside of compromise recovery and they say, how many customers actually do this? My response is 100% of the compromised customers all do paws. And that's a
Now.
thing. Yeah,
Now.
now do it exactly right. So the idea
Yeah.
of do it ahead of time, do this isolation ahead of time. Invite us over for lunch instead of invite us over for CR.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I hear all the time people say stuff like, "Well, I'm 100% patched. There's no way that I need to worry about any of this." And patching reduces the footprint, right? The target footprint, but nothing stops a compromised credential or some phishing email that gets in and performs some functionality or somebody that falls for some social engineering trick. So we do the best we can when it comes to making sure the OS is secure and that any security holes that may exist in the OS get patched and let's be fair, those holes open and shut all the time, right? We release a new product. Oh, hey, we forgot about that. Let's release a patch for that, or something along those lines. And that happens all the time. But social engineering, credential theft, those types of things, there's no patches for that ever.
It's true, because that's about process, and we can change the process, and that is a sufficient control. We have gone places where every tool you can imagine has been essentially circumvented by an attacker. And I don't want to go pointing fingers because it includes lots of Microsoft tools, but the idea that you're going to put in some security tool that's going to fix this problem, to me, that's a fool's errand, and it's not a waste of money, but certainly in terms of blocking an attacker, it's a waste of money. This comes down to Proctor's second law of human behavior, which says everybody clicks. And because everybody clicks, eventually somebody's going to click. And if we don't instantiate those security zones, then when one person clicks, it turns into an event for the entire organization. If we properly implement those security zones, one person clicks and it's a bad day for them, but it's not a bad day for everybody else.
Yeah. Gotcha.
So you don't want to meet me professionally? What do? 3 Ps. I got a whole nother slide that's going to talk about those. That's patched, paws, and passwords. Patched, paws, and passwords. And if you remember nothing else from this whole talk, please remember patched, paws, and passwords. The way the theory goes, you have to have control of Active Directory before you can work down to your servers to secure them. Active Directory, because it controls the entire Windows environment, must be secure first. And there is no fancy FUSIT that is going to fix that problem without the isolation. As well, if with most customers who are connected on-prem and in the cloud, you need to clean up on-prem if you're going to sync with the cloud. If you don't do that, then you just sort of bring your brown into the green field, which is definitely not good. So except for one line on this slide, I wrote this slide in 2005. And so that idea about what is it you need to do to be secure has been around, well, for a really long time. And I will show you which line is the new line that came in 2012. But it starts with patched, and it means everything is patched, everything. That idea that you're going to have Java, well, I have yet to be in a place that has only current running Java. I've never seen it. I have yet to be in a place that has only current level Flash. I have yet to be in a place that has no unsupported operating systems or software. And unsupported software is the very definition of unpatchable. And if it can't be patched, it's a problem. And I often tell customers when I'm talking to them outside of the compromised recovery scenario that if you don't do this, there's nothing else that's going to matter because you've just opened the door. And yep, it's the table stakes. It's the first thing you have to do, and it's got to be 100%. I would say that when we go and do investigations, I can't remember a single time when we don't find dozens of machines missing dozens of patches, dozens. And so when customers tell me, yep, we're patched, we're 100% patched, my first response is prove it. And if you don't have a report that shows with about 98% veracity that every one of your machines is up to date on patching, you don't have a report that says that, you aren't patched, because you don't know. The second step, the third P, or second P, is about isolating high value assets. No, that doesn't start with a P, but yeah, in the middle there about the dedicated admin workstation, that's about paws. This idea that you divide the assets into security zones and then administrate and operate administration of each security zone within the security zone. This comes down to, and I say this one all the time, no control up, no exposure down. From a lower security zone, you may not control a higher security zone, and any of the accounts and assets in a higher security zone should not be exposed in a lower security zone. The only way to meet that security model and still do administration of your environment is to have a dedicated admin workstation. And clearly, this isolation has gigantic ramifications across your entire environment. The third P about passwords, we've known this literally forever, that if you have a single password that works on multiple machines, then when an attacker obtains that password, they can go wherever that password works. And that's pretty broad. We see this often with help desk accounts, where the help desk account is in the local administrator group of every machine. So I compromise a Windows 7 box. I do something that causes help desk to connect in. I now collect and reuse the credentials from that help desk user, and now I just go to town. And if in fact the local administrator password is the same on all of the machines, well, then it's even easier. So that idea about having unique passwords everywhere is really important. In terms of what's changed since 2005, that's the line that's changed since 2005. And the other thing that's sort of changed is that while it used to be that unpatched software was how attackers got in, as Jim mentioned, that for the past 5 or 8 years, it seems to be we get somebody to click if we're an attacker. And so that idea of phishing or spear phishing and then credential theft and reuse seems to be the most common way the attackers get in today. So in the last 15 years, the only thing that's changed about how do you do security to start is those two things. People often ask, how long do you have to patch? And when this slide first came out, I told people, you have 30 days. If you have all of your machines patched in 30 days, you're in really good shape. And then it went down to 1 week. That happened in 2017 when we saw attackers weaponize our patches in 7 days. And that went down to 7 days. And people say, no, it's not possible. But every place I go, when we really think through what needs to happen for high value assets, we really can do it more quickly. Inside of Microsoft, what we say is it's at least no longer than 3 days for high value assets, 72 hours. And that idea that we can, for the highest value assets, protect them that quickly sounds like it might be impossible with all the testing that's required with this, that, and the other thing. And I say there is a way to do it. You just haven't thought through it to do it, but you have to. You have to. And finally, I just want to say thank you for your time. I know it's been a while listening to us all, and just thank you very much for that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. First, two things. Number one, 25 years is a long time at Microsoft, so thank you for that. And second, the thing that I thought was funny is that when you wrote that one slide you were talking about, you'd only been at Microsoft for 10 years. So that slide would be a teenager now.
Yeah, well, I was just really new and unexperienced when I wrote that slide, having been at Microsoft only 10 years.
Yeah, you were a noob.
I know, it's true. I've only been doing security for about 6 of those years. And
Wow.
so in a lot of ways it was naive, but the longer I kept it, the more I thought, well, it may be naive, but it seems to be true.
Yeah, great stuff. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with us today. It's certainly a great presentation, great slide deck, great information, and we really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Lex.
All right, guys, that's your taste of Premiere.